Leave it, that dog's not our problem." The word sliced through the cold like a blade. Officer Wade didn't even slow his pace as he stepped over the icy curb, boots crunching in the frozen slush. His partner, Officer Mendez, hesitated, eyes locked on the shape huddled beside the chain-link fence, a German shepherd, muzzled, chained, no shelter. Snow crusted over its back like armor. Its eyes, dull and half-lidded, barely moved. Mendez shifted his weight. "It's 12 degrees out. That's not neglect. That's not cities overwhelmed," Wade muttered. "It's not bleeding. It's not barking. That chain's outside city property. We log it, move on, end of story." But it wasn't the end, because 2 blocks over, inside a quiet, narrow house with curtains drawn tight and the thermostat barely clicking on, a woman was already watching that street. Through an old set of binoculars. Her name was Mara Collins, and she had once been married to a cop who had stopped for a different dog, years ago, under different snow. Mara hadn't worn her wedding ring in over a year, not since the accident, but she still kept it in a small velvet pouch in her coat pocket. It was the only thing that reminded her she'd once belonged to a world with rules and uniforms and people who ran toward trouble instead of writing reports about it. She set down the binoculars and pulled on her boots. She didn't call animal control. She didn't ask permission. She just walked. By the time she reached the lot, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows that bent across the chain link like prison bars. The dog didn't lift its head when she approached. It was too far past fear, too deep into resignation. Its ribs were sharp against the matted fur. A raw patch marred one of its paws. Someone had left it there intentionally. The chain wasn't old. The muzzle was tight, secure. This wasn't abandonment, it was disposal. Mara knelt in the snow, ignoring the burn in her knees. "You're not going to die like this," she said softly. The dog blinked. She reached into her coat, slowly, methodically, and pulled out a pocket knife. It took effort. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, and the clasp was worn, but eventually, she slipped the blade under the chain's lock. She didn't touch the dog, not yet. She just worked the chain loose, careful not to jolt it. "I knew a shepherd once," she murmured. "His name was Boomer. My husband's canine. Big, loyal, loud, terrified of thunderstorms. He used to jump in bed with us like a child. My husband thought it was ridiculous. We let him do it anyway." The chain fell away. The dog didn't run, didn't move. Mara stood slowly, gave it space, then removed her coat and laid it gently on the snow beside him. She sat on it, not touching him, not reaching out, just there, waiting. 30 minutes passed. The dog's ears twitched. A small sign, a question. When it finally lifted its head and sniffed the coat, Mara exhaled softly, her breath fogging in the air. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can choose when." That night, she slept in her hallway with a blanket wrapped around her and the shepherd curled by the door, still silent, still unsure. She'd carried him into her car using a towel and a prayer, and when he didn't resist, she understood more than she could say. This was a dog that had known hands only as tools of punishment. She didn't name him, not yet. Names meant trust. Names meant you were staying. The next morning she took him to the vet. No tag, no chip, just old scars, frostbitten pads, and a body that had learned to stay quiet, to stay alive. The vet said he was about 4, intact, underweight. But what caught her attention most was the way he kept glancing at Mara, not with affection, not yet, but with something closer to hope wrapped in disbelief. On the way home, Mara pulled into the old precinct parking lot. She hadn't stepped foot inside since the funeral. Her husband's photo was still on the wall in the back hallway, right under the faded citation he never mentioned but always kept polished. She walked inside without looking up, her heart hammering. Officer Wade was at the front desk, his mouth twisted when he saw her. "Mara Binawal." She set a copy of the vet report on the counter. "You left him to die." Wade shrugged. "Can't save every stray." He wasn't a stray. Wade leaned forward. "You're going to turn this into a crusade. You think this makes up for it." "Don't." She cut in sharply, her voice low. "Don't you dare say his name to make yourself feel better about who you've become." He didn't answer. She turned and walked out. That night the shepherd barked for the first time, just once. Short, raspy, like he'd forgotten what his voice was for. Mara smiled for the first time in months. She still hadn't given him a name, but he'd earned something else, her silence, her time, her presence. And in a world that had discarded him like trash, that was more than most ever gave. The first few days were quiet, too quiet. The shepherd barely moved from his spot near the radiator, and when he did, it was only to shift his weight or glance toward the door when Mara entered the room. He hadn't barked again. He hadn't growled either. He was more ghost than dog, present, but unreachable. Mara didn't try to change that. She kept her movements slow, her voice low, and her distance respectful. She fed him by hand, not because he couldn't eat on his own, but because it forced her to sit with him close but never imposing. He took the food without eye contact, jaw tight, every muscle poised for escape. On the third night, she lit a candle and placed it beside her husband's badge on the mantel. It was the anniversary. 3 years to the day since she had answered the door at 2:18 a.m. and found 2 officers standing there with rain in their collars and sympathy rehearsed behind their eyes. She'd known the moment she saw them. They didn't need to speak. His name was Daniel Collins. He'd been the kind of cop who carried dog biscuits in his chest pocket and gave them out with the same gravity. He applied to writing citations. His K9 partner, Boomer, had died just 6 months before him, shot during a warehouse breach that Daniel never quite recovered from. Mara used to find him in the garage sitting beside Boomer's empty crate, talking like the dog was still there. Grief had a strange way of softening a man and hardening a woman. She hadn't meant to find another shepherd. She certainly hadn't meant to keep him. But when she looked into that dog's eyes chained to the fence, she saw the same thing she saw in herself every morning in the mirror. Someone who had been left behind and didn't know why. By the end of the week, she started calling him Ghost. Not officially, not out loud at first, just in her head. It fits the way he moved through the house, like he was unsure whether he was allowed to exist. But there was a moment, just after sunrise on the 7th morning, when everything shifted. She was pouring coffee, leaning on the counter in her robe, when the soft sound of claws on hardwood made her turn. He was standing in the hallway, staring not at her but at the wall beside the fireplace, where Daniel's badge still hung in its frame. He didn't move, just stood there, ears slowly lifting, tail twitching with something that wasn't quite the recognition, but wasn't far from it either. She approached, one step at a time. He didn't run. She stood beside him and looked at the badge. He would have liked you, she said. Ghost sat down, not command-trained, not conditioned, just settled that it was the first time she let herself hope. That same afternoon, she received a call from the precinct. It wasn't Wade. It was a younger officer, someone Mara didn't know well, but the voice was tense. "There's something you should see," he said. She met him 2 hours later at the station, in a back room away from cameras and desks. He placed a thin file in front of her. No name on the cover. Just a date and location, the lot where she found Ghost. Inside were grainy surveillance photos from a security camera mounted across the alley. One of them showed a black SUV. The next showed a man stepping out, dragging the dog by a leash. The third showed him chaining the animal to the fence and driving off. No plates, no clear facial ID, but there was one detail that froze her blood. The man wore a jacket with the department's insignia. Not current issue. Vintage customized. A retired cop. Wade wouldn't open a case, the officer said quietly, said it was pointless. But this didn't sit right with me. Mara stared at the file, her pulse steady but sharp. "Do you think he's local?" The officer nodded. "We checked transfers. There are only 6 XK9 handlers in the last 10 years who still live in state. 3 are dead. 2 are retired out of county. That leaves 1. Mara already knew the name before he said it. Alan Drew. She remembered him vaguely older than Daniel. Known for being hard-edged, all instinct and dominance. Rumors had circled after his retirement. Something about excessive force. Something about disciplinary intervention with his dogs. Nothing confirmed. She returned home in silence. Ghost didn't greet her at the door, but he didn't hide anymore. She sat on the floor beside him, the file in her lap, and whispered Daniel's name for the first time in months. The dog tilted his head. Just a little, but enough. It wasn't just about saving a dog anymore. It was about confronting what the badge sometimes hides, what it fails to see, what it enables when no one looks too closely. The next morning, Mara called Priya Methesane, an attorney who had once helped a girl and her shepherd fight a system that wanted to erase them. The case was different now. The patterns weren't. "I don't want revenge," Mara told her. "I want exposure. I want this to stop happening." Priya didn't hesitate. "Then we do it by the book." Quiet, steady, relentless. They began the process, reporting the footage to Animal Services, filing a formal cruelty complaint, preparing statements. It would take weeks, maybe longer. But Mara had time now. And this time, she wasn't mourning alone, because Ghost had stopped avoiding the light. He followed her from room to room now, not just out of caution but connection. And Mara had stopped whispering his name in her head. She said it out loud. "Every morning, let's go." And he went. Every time. The days moved with a new rhythm after Mara filed the report. Ghost had begun responding to her voice, not just with motion but with attention. When she called his name, his ears would perk. Sometimes he'd turn his head fully. Once, she caught him wagging his tail, small, cautious, like the instinct had returned before the fear could suppress it. He was learning how to trust again, and so was she. But just as the quiet began to feel stable, a call came from Priya. "There's a problem," the lawyer said, voice clipped and low. "Alan Drew was notified of the complaint this morning. We expected pushback, but he's filed a countersuit." Mara froze. For what? Defamation and trespassing. Her stomach dropped. "He left a dog chained to die in the snow, and he's claiming you stole it from his property." Mara pressed her palm to her forehead. "There was no house, no gate. It was a public lot behind a condemned building." "He's saying you entered his fenced boundary and took personal property," Priya replied. "It's a legal bluff, but it buys him time and worse, it casts doubt." Mara sat in silence. She could already see how it would play out. The department reluctant to drag a former officer through the mud. A few convenient gaps in record-keeping. A story about a retired K9 who had been difficult and unadoptable. Suddenly, the man who chained a dog to die became a misunderstood retiree, and the woman who saved it a grieving widow meddling where she didn't belong. She hung up the phone and walked outside. Ghost followed. He didn't need a leash anymore. He stuck close, naturally. The winter sun was pale and sharp, casting long shadows across the grass. Mara crouched beside him and looked at the worn patch on his right ear, healed now, but permanent. A scar that didn't ask for pity, just acknowledgement. "All right," she said to him. "We fight." She started gathering everything. Photos, vet records, witness statements, the footage. She even found the coat she had laid down beside him that night, the one with a faint bloodstain near the sleeve where the muzzle had cut into his mouth. She placed it all in a box and labeled it evidence for him. But then came the knock. 2 officers. Civilian uniforms. Polite, but practiced. They handed her a notice court summons for mediation, set for 2 weeks from that Friday. "We're just the messengers, ma'am," one of them said. "This is standard." "What about what he did?" Mara asked. "Right now, it's word against word." After they left, Mara stood in the hallway for a long time, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. She wasn't afraid of Drew. She was afraid of the silence, of the quiet way institutions could erase pain without ever acknowledging it existed. Ghost sat nearby watching her. Then, without prompting, he stood and walked into the living room. He poured at a small storage box Daniel had kept under the side table, a place Mara hadn't touched in nearly 3 years. She knelt beside him and opened it. Inside were training logs, photos, notes, certificates. Most belonged to Boomer Daniels. K9. One laminated page caught her eye. An official commendation for a civilian intervention. Daniel had once stopped an officer from euthanizing a service dog that had lashed out under stress. He'd argued the case, documented the trauma, and proved it wasn't aggression, it was fear. The city had changed its policy after that. She held the paper in her hands and laughed quietly, part grief, part disbelief. It was all still here. The answers, the precedent, the proof that change had already been possible once. 2 days before mediation, she received another envelope. No name, no return address. Inside was a photograph, blurry, taken from a second-story window. It showed Drew's SUV, same alley, same chain. Only this time there was a second dog in the background. A younger shepherd, smaller, leaner, a red X was drawn over the dog's figure. Mara's chest went cold. She stared at the photo for a long time before placing it in the evidence box. Then she called Priya. "We're not just dealing with neglect," Mara said. "We're dealing with someone who's done this more than once." Priya's voice was calm but steady. "Then this isn't a defense case anymore. It's a pattern." The morning of mediation, Mara dressed in a dark sweater and brought Ghost with her. Legally, he didn't have to be present, but she wanted him there, not for show, not to prove anything, but because she didn't trust a single person in that room to speak for him except her. Drew arrived late. He walked in with a casual stride, dressed in a leather jacket, expression smug. He glanced at Ghost with thinly veiled contempt, still dragging that mutt around. He said, loud enough to be heard. Mara stood up. "His name is Ghost." Drew laughed, but it was hollow-fitting. "Looks like something that should have stayed buried." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Priya stepped forward, handed the mediator a packet of documents, then added a flash drive containing the photo, time-stamped and sourced. The mediation itself was short. Drew tried to bluster, tried to spin the narrative of an unmanageable dog and an overstepping woman. But the evidence was layered, careful, and surgical. By the time Priya played a video of Ghost responding to basic commands from Maricom, consistent and fully under control, the silence in the room was heavy. The mediator didn't give a final ruling. That would come later. But her words before they adjourned left little doubt. Regardless of intent, what we have here is not a question of ownership. It's a question of humanity. Mara left the room with Ghost beside her, tail raised, steps steady. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not a blizzard this time, just a slow drift. Ghost lifted his head to the sky, eyes narrowing in the light. Then he looked at her, and for the first time, Mara swore she saw something like peace in his eyes. Not survival, not fear, just peace. The snow didn't stop that week. It came soft and constant, muting the world with its stillness. Mara welcomed the quiet. It gave her time to think, time to prepare. She spent her mornings walking Ghost through the back alleys of her neighborhood, retracing steps from the night she found him. He moved more freely, now shoulders relaxed, head lifted, but there was always a flicker of caution in his stride. He never let her out of his peripheral, as if every joy was something that could still be taken. The court hadn't ruled yet. The mediator's report was under review. Drew had gone silent, which didn't sit right with Mara. Men like him didn't go quiet unless they were preparing to be loud in ways that couldn't be traced back, and she was right to worry. It started with phone calls, anonymous, always hanging up when answered. Then a tire/neatly done, no message left, and finally a voicemail. No words, just the sound of a barking dog. Then a sudden whimper, followed by the click of disconnection. She didn't report it. There was no point. It was always just below legal. Just enough to remind her of the line between justice and intimidation. But it didn't shake her. If anything, it told her she was getting too close to something Drew wanted buried. Then a name surfaced. Priya's investigator, working through old department logs and whispered favors, found something odd. A handler's report filed under Drew's name from nearly 6 years ago. The file included a dog's profile, German Shepherd, male, 3 years old at the time, marked as transferred to private rehoming, but there was no adoption paperwork, no record of the dog ever being placed, just a single closing line. Disposition approved off record. Ghost wasn't the first, and he likely wasn't the second either. Mara sat in her car that night, engine off, the report in her lap. Her breath fogged the windshield. Ghost was in the back seat, watching the door.com. She hadn't known how far Drew's actions reached. She thought she was saving one dog, but now she saw it for what it was, a pattern, a quiet culling of dogs, deemed too much trouble, too far gone, too stained by human mistakes. And the man behind it, he wore the same badge Daniel once wore with pride. That night, Mara made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for the court to decide whether Ghost could legally stay. She was going to make sure no other dog ended up like him the next morning. She went to the precinct not as a widow, not as a civilian, but as a witness. She requested a formal meeting with the Internal Affairs Unit. And when they asked why, she said one word: Drew. What followed was hours of interviews, forms, exhibits. Priya brought the full dossier: photos, time-stamped footage, witness statements, training inconsistencies, vet records. But what truly shifted the tone was the final document. A statement, unsigned, submitted anonymously 2 years earlier, alleging misconduct in the K9 program under Drew's leadership. The claim had been dismissed due to lack of follow-through. Mara read the closing lines of that report aloud in the room. I don't want to lose my job, but I'm more afraid of staying silent. These dogs deserve more than what they're getting. The IA officer across from her said nothing at first, then nodded once and slid the file into a sealed envelope. We'll open an inquiry. It wasn't a promise, but it was movement. When she returned home, Mara collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. Ghost patted over and placed his head in her lap, not demanding, just steady. She stroked his ears and whispered, "We're not done yet." 2 nights later, someone tried to break into her garage. She heard the clang first, the quiet rattle of a metal latch being tested. She rose slowly, her breath caught halfway to her chest. She moved to the window and saw a figure in the dark, too large to be a kid, too steady to be a drifter. Before she could reach for the phone, Ghost exploded from the living room with a bark that rattled the windows. He hit the back door like a thunderclap, the sound primal, warning. The figure vanished into the night. Mara stood in the doorway, shaking. She wasn't scared, not really, but something inside her had snapped back into place. They weren't just protecting a dog anymore. They were protecting a truth someone didn't want seen. She installed cameras the next morning, floodlights, updated locks. Priya filed a police report. Nothing came of it, of course, but now they were watching too. The official ruling came the following week, a formal letter, embossed with the court seal. Mara sat on the porch steps with Ghosts beside her as she opened it. Her hands didn't shake. She already knew: permanent custodial rights granted to Ms. Mara Collins. Dog in question no longer considered property of former handler due to proven neglect and misconduct under sworn statement and supporting documentation. Ghosts was no longer evidence, no longer disputed. He was home. Mara exhaled slowly, and Ghost nudged her hand with his nose. She looked at him, smiling for real this time. We won. But it didn't feel like a win. Not exactly. Because justice rarely does. It felt like repair, quiet, earned, and still unfinished. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through the softening ground. The return of birdsong, the way sunlight lingered just a little longer in the late afternoon. For Mara, it didn't feel like renewal so much as release. The kind that comes after a long, bruising silence, after too many days spent holding everything together because falling apart had never felt like an option. Ghost walked beside her now without hesitation. No leash, no commands, just unspoken agreement. He stayed close, not out of fear, but because she had become the place he chose to return to. The court's ruling had given her legal ownership, but what truly changed was quieter. No one knocked anymore. The phone didn't ring with veiled threats, and when she walked past the precinct to get her coffee, officers she barely knew nodded respectfully, a few even smiling in a way that didn't feel forced. Her presence no longer made people shift uncomfortably, it made them remember. Maybe because she didn't just speak for Ghost, maybe because she reminded them of Daniel, of the way things should have been. Mara didn't seek credit. She didn't care about headlines or awards. When a local reporter reached out for an interview, she declined. "It's not a story," she said. "It's a responsibility." And when the woman tried to press her, asking why she wouldn't want people to know what she'd done, Mara simply said, "Because there are more like him. And they don't need sympathy. They need someone to show up before it's too late." I had started volunteering again. Quietly, at the local shelter. Not with people, she wasn't ready for that, but with the dogs no one wanted. The ones to shut down, to wag their tails, the ones who'd forgotten their names or never had one in the first place. Ghost came with her, not as a therapy dog, but as an example. She didn't train him to perform. She let him sit near the broken ones, breathe beside them, exists as proof that survival didn't have to end in silence. One afternoon, a boy came in with a foster coordinator, maybe 10 years old, cheeks sunburned, sleeves too short. He didn't speak much, just sat cross-legged in front of one of the kennels where a trembling husky had been refusing food for 2 weeks. Ghost walked over and lay down next to the boy, not touching him, just mirroring. After a few minutes, the boy reached out first to the dog behind the bars, then to Ghost. His hand hovered for a second, then rested on Ghost's back. The coordinator watched from a distance. He hasn't touched another living thing in 2 months. Mara didn't respond. She just watched. That was all she ever did now. Not intervene, not correct. Just give space to what needed to unfold. That night, she sat with Ghost on the porch, legs stretched across the worn wooden boards. She sipped from her mug and stared at the sky, where stars blinked behind clouds. You know, she said softly, I used to think rescue meant pulling someone out of something. She reached down and ran her hand through his fur. But sometimes it just means refusing to let them go back in. Ghost let out a low breath, the kind that always came right before he rested his head on her knee. He did it every time she spoke like that. Every time her words carried the weight of something unsaid. Her work with the shelter began to grow quietly. They asked her to sit on the advisory board, not for politics but for insight, to help train new fosters how to work with trauma dogs. She accepted on one condition, that no one ever expects transformation in a day. We don't fix them, she told the board. We stay with them until they start to remember who they were before it hurt. And that became her philosophy, not only for dogs, but for people, too. She hung Daniel's badge in a new frame, not in the hallway anymore, but in the living room where the light hit it just right in the mornings. Ghosts would sometimes sit in front of it, head tilted, as if listening. Mara stopped correcting him. Let him sit as long as he needed. Maybe he remembered the weight of a badge, or maybe he was just drawn to the silence of the man who used to carry it with honor. Drew never returned. His case was quietly closed, the inquiries into past K-9 unit misconduct buried under layers of review. But Mara didn't need headlines to know she'd changed something. The shelter's intake policies were stricter now. Retired K-9 South were paired with behavioral counselors, and officers who failed to document properly were no longer reassigned quietly. Some changes were visible, others would take longer. But they had started. One evening she took Ghost to the same field where Daniel used to train with Boomer. It had been years since she stood there. The old obstacles were gone, replaced with wild grass and the rusted outlines of what used to be structure. She let Ghost off the leash and watched him run, not fast, not frantic, just steady. She hadn't seen him run before, not like this. She stayed until the sun sank, until the world was blue and gold and soft with memory. When Ghost returned, he leaned against her leg, chest heaving, tongue out. You were never too much, she whispered. You were just too honest for the wrong kind of hands. He sat, and for a long time neither of them moved, and that's how it ended, not with victory, but with stillness. A woman who had once lived in the shadow of grief, a dog who had once been left to die in the snow, and a quiet promise between them to never let silence speak louder than care, and to walk together wherever the path led next.